A Russian dry cargo ship exploded and sank. Are the occupiers going to march on Kherson, and can the war in Ukraine end in 2025? Let's talk to David Sharp, a war correspondent. David, hello?
Спасибо огромное за поддержку. Здравствуйте, Ольга, и с наступающим праздником всех, кто его празднует, и всех, для кого он важен.
On December 24th, it was reported that a Russian dry cargo ship, Ursa Major, from the Russian Defense Ministry's fleet, sank in the waters of the Mediterranean Sea due to an explosion on board. The explosion and sinking of the ship, as Defense Express writes, looks unusual given the size of the vessel, length 140 meters, width 23 meters, less than the cruiser Moskva. What details are known about? Various military cargoes from the Syrian port of Tartus, which, by the way, it has done in the past, a port that is now apparently in the process of evacuation. So it's possible that something will remain there, but we don't know yet. According to official data, there was an explosion in the engine room. In reality, unfortunately, it is difficult to answer the question of how it happened. Naturally, since there is a war going on, and sabotage has repeatedly occurred on the territory of Russia, we all wonder, first of all, was there sabotage here? It is too early to judge. In fact, maybe some data will come to light, although in the context of the sunken ship, it sounds a bit funny. But since it sank, even a Russian official investigation is unlikely. As far as we can speculate, there is a definite possibility of sabotage, but I wouldn't rush to final conclusions.
Через Суэцкий канал и далее обогнуть Азию и во Владивосток. По неофициальным оно должно было эвакуировать различные военные грузы из сирийского порта Тартус, что оно, кстати, делало и в прошлом. Порт, который сейчас, видимо, в процессе эвакуации. То есть, возможно, что-то там и сохранится, но мы пока не знаем. Согласно официальным данным, был взрыв в машинном отделении. Реально, к сожалению, сложно ответить на вопрос, как это произошло. Естественно, так как идет война и неоднократно на территории России происходили диверсии, то в первую очередь мы все интересуемся, была ли здесь диверсия. Судить рано, на самом деле, может быть, кое-какие всплывут какие-то данные, хотя всплывут. В контексте утонувшего судна это звучит немного даже забавно. Но так как оно затонуло, то даже провести даже российское официальное расследование вряд ли может быть проведено в этом месте. Насколько можно предположить, есть определенная вероятность диверсии, но я бы не торопился с выводами окончательными.
If it is sabotage, there are two versions: Ukrainian security services or Russian underground. Although such actions usually occur on personal initiative, it is unlikely that the ship was sunk without a plan. The options are technical malfunction or sabotage.
В России происходят случаи поджогов и диверсий, такие спонтанные достаточно действия по личной инициативе, но мне сложно предположить, что кто-то утопил судно по такой личной инициативе, так что версии 2, либо техническая неисправность какая-то,
Time will tell.
Либо в самом деле диверсия, время покажет.
Regarding the criticality of this loss, Russia's defense capability will not be significantly reduced, but this ship costs a lot of money. It played a role in all sorts of logistical transportation for Russia, so it is certainly a sensitive point loss, but no more than that. It is not worth exaggerating the importance of this event, but if it did take place, it could indeed be a sabotage. That is, either the saboteurs were operating on Russian territory or somewhere on the way to this place of death. This would, of course, be very interesting. The question is when we will get reliable information. It's a rhetorical question right now. David, let me remind you that it was previously believed that the Ursa Major was going to Syria to evacuate Russian equipment, but in fact, the ship was heading to Vladivostok. There was valuable cargo on board, as Crimean Wind wrote about. The photos and video show two 45-ton hatches in the back of the ship covered with blue tarpaulin, and these are the covers, as they say, of the nuclear reactor of the icebreaker of the Leader project. The loss of these two hatches is said to significantly delay its construction. I think there will be more information to come. We'll find out. Ukrainian drones attacked the Millerovo airbase in Russia's Rostov region on Monday. The targets could be the remaining Su-25 attack aircraft of the Russian Federation Air Force, which are still taking off from this airfield to attack Ukraine. At the same time, as Forbes analyst David Axe writes, the purpose of such AFU strikes is not always to destroy specific buildings or pieces of equipment. According to the founder, the goal of Front Intelligence Insight Inc., an analytical group, is to increase the cost of war for Russia. How well that strategy is working now, as you can see, given that as Ukraine increases its use of deep strike munitions, Western missiles, its own missiles, drones, the Russians are moving, as we see their forces further and further away from the front line. Certainly, this strategy is worth considering along a number of general parameters. First, the damage is important. In some cases, the damage may not be very great, but it matters in terms of psychological impact and diversion of resources. In some cases, the damage is significant. When we're talking about ammunition depot explosions or even aircraft damage, even an individual aircraft disabled on the runway. Such damage has direct military significance when the enemy is forced to divert resources, for example, financial and material, to protect airfields, to build new facilities deep behind the lines. This also has significance. War is a kind of puzzle that is made up of various components, and the events that take place directly on the battlefield, on the battle line, are only one of the components, albeit the most important one. The other component is exposure to the rear, where the enemy should not feel safe, where he should be thinking all the time about how do I defend myself. It diverts resources and thoughts to other more important things. As for airfields, drone attacks can have two purposes, besides destroying the airplanes themselves under certain fortunate circumstances and ammunition depots. And this has happened many times, or fuel and lubricants at airfields. Russian aviation is causing problems not only at the front, but also at the rear. And even Su-25 airplanes, which by and large do not meet modern high specifications and are unable to use the most dangerous weapon systems, are also irritants. If those planes make fewer sorties or are forced to be moved somewhere far away, that's a success worth the price of admission. So even if you don't destroy a single airplane, but the enemy makes fewer sorties, you've saved lives. You've saved property that could have been damaged.
То, что украинцы успешно развили, на начальном этапе эти возможности были близки к нулю, развили то, что я называю длинной рукой.
On the whole, we see throughout this past year that the Ukrainians have successfully developed, and at the initial stage, these capabilities were close to zero, what I call a long arm. That is, the ability to systematically in large quantities, with fairly effective weapons, to strike multiple targets deep inside Russia. This is both tens of kilometers from the front line and more than 1,000 kilometers. But of course, there is much to aspire to here. Obviously, the same drones are not enough for this strategy to work fully and effectively, i.e., the enemy would suffer very serious damage and very serious resources would be diverted. Here we need more effective means, long-range effective means. And just what the Ukrainians obviously lack is their own missiles, cruise and ballistic missiles, which would hit targets on the enemy's territory in the proper quantities and with the appropriate results. This strategy could be more systematic and effective, creating a mutual deterrence effect. Russia, realizing that its strikes could trigger a mirror response on its own facilities, might consider whether to continue such actions. Perhaps with an effective long arm, it should refrain from strikes, especially against energy and other important targets. The Economist recently wrote that Ukrainian engineers are developing a Trembita missile capable of reaching Moscow, and its testing is about to begin. Also, a month's worth of production of parts for the Shaheds may have been destroyed in Tatarstan.
На практике, как работает эта ракета. Я предлагаю вам вспомнить еще Татарстан, потому что есть мысль о том, что в результате удара по российскому складу с деталями к дронам «Камикадзе» «Шахед» в Татарстане мог быть уничтожен минимум месячный объем выпуска продукции. Такое мнение высказал председатель правления Альянса «Новая энергия Украины», основатель компании и
as a result of the hit on the warehouse. Let me remind you that on the night of December 23rd, a large warehouse with parts for Shahed attack drones suddenly burst into flames in Russia. The amount of losses for the occupiers reaches at least $16 million. Could these really be components for 2, 3, or maybe even 4 months ahead, depending on what these components are and the logistics of their delivery? To answer this question, you need to know the details. Naturally, there is a notion of what is desirable and what is real. The desirable thing is that production should suffer as much as possible, but it is difficult to answer this question without intelligence data. The only important thing to note is that Shahed-type drones have some key details. That is, the drone is assembled from many components, and always in such complex, though at the same time simple systems, there are elements whose delay in delivery will obviously slow down the assembly. But what exactly happened and what significance it had, I cannot answer. As far as we know, the rate of production or the share of Russian production is still not quite clear. We are talking about assembly from Iranian components brought to Russia. The general sense is that production volumes have been significant in recent months. Figures are mentioned that seem unrealistic, such as up to 200 drones per month. That seems impossible to me. However, the fact that many hundreds, perhaps even around 1,000, are being produced is a realistic prospect.
На ближайшие месяцы существенно снизить их производство, это колоссальной важности, это результат, подчеркиваю, колоссальной важности.
If it is possible to significantly reduce production for the coming months, it will be a result of colossal importance. Such a result will save many Ukrainian lives and a significant amount of resources, including air defense systems. Imagine 500 fewer drones flying in the next 2 months. This cannot be overemphasized, but it's always worth waiting for reliable information to make a yes or no conclusion. I think there will be reports on what happens soon. I suggest we move on to what's happening on the battlefield right now. Russian troops are gradually advancing near Pokrovske. However, it is not yet known whether they intend to capture the city or plan to move towards the administrative borders of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions, as part of the Kremlin's political and informational goal of capturing the entire Donetsk region. This is stated in a report by analysts of the American Institute for the Study of War. The situation in the Pokrovske area, as well as in Donetsk region as a whole, is very difficult. In my opinion, Pokrovsk is a priority target for the Russian army. It is possible that the city will not be stormed head-on, but will try to bypass it. All successful captures, or almost all successful captures, have occurred when Russia outflanked rather than breaking into a sustained defense. An example of a successful defense, despite a certain enemy advance, remains Chasov Yar. The town could be held since spring, a very long time, despite its small size.
Возможно, его не пытаются штурмовать в лоб, его попытаются обойти. Все успешные захваты, ну или почти все успешные захваты России тех или иных крупных населенных пунктов были тогда, когда им удалось обойти с флангов, а не пытаться проломить в устойчивую оборону в лоб,
At the same time, the enemy's flanking actions elsewhere were leading to a defense crisis. The lion's share of efforts will probably be directed at Pokrovsk, but the onslaught on other parts of the front will also continue. So far, there is no reason to believe that Russia has run out of resources, although the replenishment of contractors has become somewhat less.
Не окажется, что погода вот прям совсем не позволит, а это вряд ли, будут направлены, львиная доля усилий будет направлена на Покровск. Но натиск и на ряде других участков фронта тоже продолжится. Нет причин считать, что у России здесь и сейчас иссякли ресурсы человеческие, несмотря на то, что, видимо,
the success of Ukrainian troops depends on the correct use of reserves so that the enemy cannot bypass strong positions from the flanks and make deep breakthroughs, as it happened this year.
Очень многое будет зависеть и конкретно в районе Покровска и на границе Днепропетровской, вблизи границы Днепропетровской и Донецкой областей, насколько украинскому командованию удастся задействовать резервы так, чтобы противник не мог обходить с флангов сильные позиции.
In addition, we see that the occupiers seek to seize a bridgehead on one of the islands or on the right bank of the Dnieper.
И именно они стали серьезными причинами того, что россияне удалось продвинуться с точки зрения географических достижений, назовем это так, избежание подобного рода последствий. Главная задача, но для этого нужны резервы и нужно их правильно использовать.
Давид, мы видим, что оккупанты стремятся захватить плацдарм на одном из островов или на правом берегу Днепра.
Their goal is to deploy firepower to shell Kherson and Ukrainian units located in the coastal zone. A representative of the Southern Defense Forces, Vladislav Voloshin, told Radio Liberty on air. According to him, this is why 5 to 7 assaults by small infantry groups are recorded daily in the Dnieper direction.
7 штурмов малыми пехотными группами. Учитывая, что цель оккупантов действительно найти слабые места.
Given that the goal of the occupiers is really to find the weak points of the AFU defense, to identify firing positions, and to reconnoiter exactly how our defense system is located. To what extent do you think the occupiers succeed or are likely to succeed in doing this? Or is it the other way around? In my opinion, it is necessary to distinguish between operations of local importance, such as attempts to seize islands, and operations with a far-reaching goal, such as the creation of a bridgehead on the right bank. If they really want to create such a bridgehead, the goals are far-reaching: to capture Kherson and, in general, to create a stable position on the right bank. However, this is a complex and large-scale task. It is not just a matter of gathering 100 boats or 200 to 500 men in assault groups. To capture a bridgehead, it is necessary to force the Dnieper. This requires either taking the Ukrainian armed forces by surprise, literally, or creating such a powerful strike fist that it is hard to even imagine where it could come from now.
Та проблема, с которой россияне столкнулись в 22 году, во второй половине 22 года на Херсонщине, на правом берегу.
And the main thing is that in addition to capturing the bridgehead, it must also be held and supplied. This is a problem that the Russians faced in 2022 on the right bank of the Kherson region, and it remains relevant. Many conditions must be met for a sustainable supply across the Dnieper River. First, it is necessary to create a serious grouping with the most powerful firepower, probably with air support. Second, once a bridgehead is captured, it must be held, expanded, and supplied. The task is ambitious. Either Russia must gain vast resources, which will not go unnoticed, or Ukrainian forces must be weakened to allow the enemy to operate. Preparing for such an operation will require a response.
Если Россия будет осуществлять подобные приготовления к большой операции, подчеркиваю, большой операции, захват плацдарма и его удержание – это большая операция. Это будет заметно, и, безусловно, на это нужно будет реагировать. Это может быть серьезной угрозой, хотя на сегодня это выглядит уж больно амбициозно.
This could become a serious threat. However, such a task looks too ambitious at the moment. As for small-scale operations, they are at the tactical level. The enemy is active on the ground, apparently having received additional forces. Here it is necessary to be as attentive as possible, trying to calculate the enemy's plans and their possible impact on the overall situation. If there are key points of serious importance, it is necessary to take appropriate measures. However, there have been no attempts to seriously force the Dnieper so far, so this direction remains secondary. In terms of firepower on Kherson, the Russians still have a wide range of options. Despite the fact that they are located across the Dnieper, the distance to the city is very short. The residents of Kherson feel this every day. Russians, by the looks of it, are more prepared for an offensive on the right bank of the Kherson region than for an activation on Zaporizhzhia. The Ukrainian military suggests that the main strike may be on Pyatikhatki, parallel to the Dnieper, with possible actions in the area of Guliai-Poli. How do you assess the situation in Zaporizhzhia region? Is it possible that the enemy is planning an offensive there, parallel to Kherson? The Kherson direction is unique because of the forcing of the Dnieper and holding the bridgehead. In the Zaporizhzhia region, fighting continues in the Velika Novosiolka area on the border with the Donetsk region, where it is important to prevent the enemy from advancing. The area up to the Dnieper has been relatively quiet, but the enemy may launch offensives using drones, artillery, and small groups to find weaknesses. A large-scale strike by large forces is unlikely, as it is not characteristic of this war.
Однако нельзя не допускать такой возможности, что противник, накопив определенные резервы, предпримет действия, похожие на те, которые он предпринимает в других направлениях. То есть, я имею в виду, ведет постоянные наступательные действия при поддержке дронов и артиллерии и небольшими группами на локальных участках в поисках слабого места.
However, if they have additional opportunities, they may become more active, especially if Ukrainian forces redistribute their reserves, for example, to Donetsk region, weakening the Zaporizhzhia direction. On the other hand, we see that the Russian army still does not have many additional reserves to launch new offensives in different areas. They lack the ability to simultaneously launch an active offensive in the Kurakhov area, in the Pokrovske area, or, for example, in the Kursk region. They are quite active there, but it is obvious that if they had additional resources, they would redeploy forces there in an effort to succeed faster and be more effective. This means that they do not have excess forces to open up a new area for a permanent offensive, which remains a rather problematic task. In any case, when we discuss this issue, an important factor remains the lack of intelligence information from those who rely on open sources. If it were known that a grouping was being formed in the rear, ammunition, equipment, and personnel were being brought in, then conclusions could be drawn quite unambiguously. When there is no such information, reasoning remains unsubstantiated. Before the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk Oblast, rumors were spread through the press about a possible Russian attack on Sumy Oblast from Kursk Oblast. As a result, we found out that the Ukrainians were actually going to attack, and there were no Russian units there that could have done so. Moreover, there was a weak defense there. This is a prime example of how lack of intelligence information can lead to erroneous conclusions. While there is no data on the formation of a significant grouping, so we can only speculate, we cannot rule out such a scenario. David, I propose to discuss one statement that the war in Ukraine will end in 2025. This was stated by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. According to him, either there will be peace talks or one of the warring parties will destroy the other. He said this in an interview with a publication. We all know who Viktor Orban is, but how should we interpret these words? How to react to them? What do you think? There is an emotional component. Of course, everyone knows very well that Viktor Orban is not a great friend of Ukraine. But let us consider the situation itself. From a military point of view, the year 2024, which is coming to an end, was not the most successful year for Ukraine. This year has been a minus sign. Nevertheless, Russia has failed to achieve its goals and high-profile successes. Therefore, in 2025, even if current trends continue, there is no reason to believe that, as Orban said, Russia will defeat Ukraine. On the other hand, there is no objective reason to assume that Ukraine will defeat Russia either. From a military point of view, there is no reason to believe that the war will end. The fighting continues, persistent. Even if there is a Russian advance, it will not mean the defeat of Ukraine, thanks to what the United States has already supplied and what the Europeans will supply. Even in the absence of American aid, I'm taking the most negative scenario, Ukraine has a very serious margin of military strength for the coming year. Another reason why the war may end is purely political, i.e. without connection to victories and defeats on the battlefield, when both sides, I emphasize, it is important here, both sides come to the conclusion that the war must end. However, it would be wrong to forecast and predict this kind of outcome. Perhaps Orban knows something more about some negotiations that are already underway, or some kind of understanding. Although I for one doubt that Orban knows much more. We are in a situation where there is a lot of talk about negotiations. There are definite signs that the mediators, primarily the United States, intend to make serious efforts to get the negotiations started, especially under the Trump administration. It cannot be ruled out here that the war may indeed end, or at least stop, in 2025. However, it is important to recall that all sides, including Russia's, are relevant here. Most importantly, much depends on what the Kremlin thinks. If they do not feel that they are in a military stalemate, then from their logic, they should not be in a hurry to end the war. The only but is that if the Americans make a serious effort to put pressure on Russia, they have such tools. The question is whether they will use them. This applies to economic sanctions and the threat or actual increase in aid to Ukraine. In such a case, Russia could become much more accommodating. On the contrary, if the United States does not use these tools, Russia will not become cooperative, and there is no point in rushing into peace talks unless it suffers significant defeats on the front lines. So the two key ingredients are the position of the United States and the actual steps it will take. David, Britain's Prime Minister, has hinted he's ready to send troops to Ukraine to train the Ukrainian armed forces. This was reported by The Times. Starmer hinted that British troops could be on Ukrainian territory in western Ukraine for the training of soldiers. Already about 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and possibly more, have been trained in the UK as part of Operation Interlex. According to The Times, sending the military to Britain involves a multi-stage journey. How realistic is it to send foreign troops to train Ukraine's armed forces? It can become, for one thing, important to understand what advantage it brings. This has the advantage that Ukrainians do not waste time traveling to the West, and training is faster and of higher quality in Ukraine. However, these places will become priority targets for enemy strikes, which will complicate the training process. I suppose there are more pluses, and it all depends on the political decision. However, it is difficult for Western countries to make this decision because of the internal risks for the military and the fear of escalation with Russia.
Которая витает в воздухе на постоянной основе. Поэтому здесь, когда мы не говорим о том, чтобы кого-то послали буквально воевать, целые части и соединения.
So when we're not talking about someone being sent literally to fight in whole units, as the North Koreans do, to fight on the front lines, that's out of the question. It's supposed to be an easier decision to make here, but so far it hasn't been made. So the probabilities should be asked of those who make the decision in the West. Hints are hints, but in this case, it is the deeds that matter. You can't put hints on bread. You need steps and actions. It all boils down, as it does in most of life, to political decisions. David, one more thing about the problem we have on the battlefield. There is a constant shortage of artillery shells at the front. European Commissioner Andrius Kubelius said that EU countries would produce about 2-meter shells for the AFU in 2025. In a commentary to Hromadske, he said that now they produce only 20 to 25% of weapons, while the rest are purchased abroad. To increase production, orders from European governments are needed, which is currently lacking. Without long-term contracts with arms manufacturers, Europe is unlikely to increase supplies to Ukraine in 2025. Europe is a heterogeneous entity with different policies and challenges. Production can be public, private, or startup. So unfortunately, when we talk about Europe, we are forced to generalize. As a result, the chances of promises not being kept and plans not being realized are very high. When it comes to such a multifaceted education, there are certain positive shifts in everything that concerns production. But it is important to realize that when we are talking about private business, private entrepreneurs should not plan 6 months ahead. We are not talking about the production of cardboard boxes. When we are talking about the production of shells or expensive ammunition, we are talking about production facilities, machines, equipment, premises, training and hiring of personnel, and qualified in most cases, or those who are to become qualified. No one is going to do all that if it is a private business working on a 1-year order. In order for things to move forward and develop, you need long-term orders over the course of years. It seems to me that there should be no problems here, even if the war ends soon. First of all, continued assistance to Ukraine will be in the interests of Western countries, because they are also interested in developing their own armed forces. Everyone understands that the times when no one suspected that wars could happen are over. The risk of war is still present. The Cold War with Russia has become a fait accompli. The threat of China is also relevant. In other words, shells are needed for themselves. Moreover, there is an increased demand in the world for the purchase of shells from the point of view of commercial benefit. So the active actions of European governments to conclude long-term contracts, even if they will initially be at a loss, should justify themselves in the medium term. However, each country has its own policy. Some countries don't have a sense of threat, like Spain or Portugal, unlike, say, Estonia or Lithuania. This is such an example. The situation is different in each country, And without long-term contracts, the strategy of developing our own military-industrial complex will yield only partial results. Hopefully, at least in terms of fulfillment of promises, the situation will be better than with the notorious 1 million shells, the delivery of which was 6 months late. As I understand it, they have only recently reported that this has been accomplished. By the way, the fact that the shells did not arrive on time must have had an impact on the situation at the front. This is very indicative of how things are done in Europe, including with promises that are detached from reality. It is to be hoped that the situation will change for the better in the coming year or years. There are reasons to believe that at least partially the situation will improve, but only life will tell how much. As we have seen this year, the Europeans could not realize their own promises, although they seemed confident in their implementation when they made them. David, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for taking the time to chat and discuss important topics. Thank you for your professional, as always, analysis. I want to remind you that David Sharp, the war correspondent, was with us today. We wish our viewers a relaxing evening, a relaxing day. Happy holidays, everyone. See you later. All the best.
До встречи и всего самого наилучшего.